Hashtag the night shift at Greenwood Cemetery. I suppose you're wondering why I'm telling you this now. Why I finally decided to speak about what happened that October night in Greenwood Cemetery. Perhaps it's the rain I can hear against my window. It sounds just like it did that evening. Or maybe it's because I've carried this weight for 3 years now, and I'm tired of pretending it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Are you somewhere comfortable right now? I hope so, because comfort is something I don't take for granted anymore. It was 2021, and I had taken a job as a night security guard at Greenwood Cemetery in upstate New York. Not the most glamorous work, I'll grant you, but the pay was decent, and I've always been a bit of a night owl. The cemetery sprawled across nearly 200 acres of rolling hills, dotted with ancient oaks and weathered headstones that dated back to the 1800s. During the day, it was actually quite peaceful. Families would visit. Children would run about whilst their parents tended to graves, and the groundskeepers would go about their business with quiet efficiency. But nights were different. My duties were straightforward enough. Patrol the grounds every 2 hours. Check the perimeter gates. Ensure no vandals or vagrants had found their way in. The cemetery had been having problems with teenagers sneaking in to drink or conduct what they believed were seances. Silly stuff, really, but the management wanted someone keeping an eye on things. The job came with a small security hut near the main entrance, just enough room for a desk, a kettle, and a bank of monitors connected to the CCTV cameras scattered throughout the grounds. Most nights passed without incident. I'd make my round with nothing but a torch and my thoughts for company, listening to the owls call to each other from the old trees. But this particular night, October 13th, if you must know, was different from the moment I arrived for my shift. The rain had started around 7 in the evening, just as I was settling in. Not a gentle shower, mind you, but a proper downpour that drummed against the roof of my little hut with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The kind of rain that makes you grateful to be indoors, that transforms familiar landscapes into something altogether more mysterious. I'd made myself a cup of tea and was reviewing the day's visitor's log when I noticed something odd on Monitor 3. The camera covered the oldest section of the cemetery, where the headstones leaned at awkward angles and the names had been worn smooth by decades of weather. Through the rain-streaked lens, I could see what appeared to be a figure standing amongst the graves. Now, this was entirely unusual. Sometimes mourners would linger after closing time, lost in grief and unaware that visiting hours had ended. Part of my job was to gently escort them to the gates. But something about this figure struck me as wrong. Somehow, they were completely still. Not the stillness of someone lost in contemplation, but the unnatural stillness of something trying very hard not to be seen. And despite the heavy rain, they appeared to be bone dry. I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting through the grainy black and white feed. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. The figure, I still couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, stood directly in front of a weathered monument, their back to the camera. They wore what looked like a long coat or dress that seemed to flow despite the absence of any wind. My first instinct was to radio them through the PA system we had installed throughout the grounds. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing through the speakers. "The cemetery is closed for the evening. I'll need you to make your way to the main gate, please." The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to hear me. I tried again, louder this time. "Sir? Madam? Greenwood Cemetery is closed. You need to leave the premises immediately." Still nothing. That's when my heart began to beat just a bit faster. You know that feeling, don't you? When something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on exactly what. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I found myself gripping the edge of my desk harder than necessary. I grabbed my torch and waterproof jacket. Time for a personal visit. The rain hit me like a wall the moment I stepped outside. Within seconds, I was soaked through despite my jacket, and my torch beam seemed pathetically weak against the darkness. The cemetery at night is a different beast entirely. Shadows play tricks on your eyes. Every rustling bush could be hiding someone, and the silence between raindrops feels heavy with possibility. I made my way along the winding path toward the old section, my footsteps squelching in the mud. The beam of my torch danced across headstones and monuments, creating an ever-shifting landscape of light and shadow. Each step took me further from the safety of my hut, deeper into a world that belonged more to the dead than the living. Have you ever walked through a cemetery at night? There's something primal about it, something that awakens instincts we thought we'd evolved beyond. Every shadow could be concealing a threat. Every sound could be a warning. Your mind begins to play tricks on you, conjuring movement where there is none, voices where there is only silence. As I approached the area where I'd seen the figure, I called out again. "Hello? Is someone there? I'm with security. I need to speak with you." My voice sounded small and insignificant against the rain and darkness. The beam of my torch swept across the monuments, illuminating carved angels with worn faces and epitaphs too faded to read. But there was no sign of the person I'd seen on the monitor. I stood there for several minutes, turning slowly in a circle, my light probing every corner of the area. The rain was coming down harder now, and I could feel it seeping to the collar of my jacket, sending cold rivulets down my spine. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ground around one particular grave was completely dry. Not just damp, not just less wet than the surrounding area. Completely impossibly dry. It formed a perfect circle around an ornate headstone, as if an invisible umbrella had been protecting that spot from the downpour. I approached slowly, my torch trained on the anomaly. The headstone was old but well-maintained, carved from black granite that reflected my torch beam like a mirror. The inscription read, "Eleanor Whitmore, 1847 to 1889. Beloved wife and mother, gone but never forgotten." Below the text was carved a single rose, its petals so delicately rendered they seemed almost alive in the dancing light. I crouched down and reached toward the dry earth, but stopped myself inches away. Something about touching that ground felt forbidden, somehow dangerous. Instead, I stood up quickly and took several steps backward, nearly stumbling over a smaller headstone in my haste. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft and melodious, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was singing, an old lullaby I recognized but couldn't quite place. The kind of song mothers might sing to comfort frightened children on stormy nights. "Rock-a-bye, baby," in the treetop. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock." The voice was beautiful, hauntingly so, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl, a sadness so profound it seemed to seep into my very bones. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but the singing seemed to come from the very air around me. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. My hands were shaking now, and not just from the cold. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, and my breathing had become shallow and rapid. Fight or flight responses were kicking in, but I couldn't decide which would be more appropriate. There was nowhere to run to, nothing to fight. The singing stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of rain against stone and the rushing of blood in my ears. I stood there in the darkness, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Should I investigate further? Should I retreat to the safety of my hut? Should I call the police? That's when I saw her. She was standing perhaps 20 feet away, barely visible in the range of my torch beam. A woman in a white dress that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in wet tendrils around her face, and her skin had the pale, luminous quality of moonlight on water. She was beautiful in a way that old portraits are beautiful, classical, timeless, but somehow not quite real, not quite alive. Eleanor, I whispered, though I don't know why I used that name. It simply felt right. She turned toward me then, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her features were delicate, almost fragile, with large dark eyes that held depths of sorrow I couldn't begin to fathom. But it was her expression that nearly sent me running. She looked hungry, desperate, as if she'd been waiting for someone like me for a very, very long time. She began to walk toward me, her feet making no sound on the wet grass. Her dress flowed around her like water, and I noticed that wherever she stepped, flowers seemed to bloom momentarily before withering away. The very air around her shimmered with an otherworldly energy that made my skin tingle with static electricity. "You came," she said, and her voice was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I've been waiting so long for someone to come." I tried to speak, tried to ask who she was, what she wanted, but my throat had constricted to the point where only a strangled whisper emerged. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot, as if the very earth was holding me there. She was close enough now that I could see the individual raindrops on her dress, could smell the scent of roses and earth that surrounded her. Her eyes never left mine, and I felt as if she were looking straight through me, seeing parts of my soul I had forgotten existed. "Do you know what it's like to be forgotten?" she asked, reaching out one pale hand toward my face. "To be alone with your grief for over a century, with no one to remember your name, no one to tend your grave?" Her fingers were inches from my cheek when I finally found my voice. "Please," I managed to croak. I don't understand. What do you want?" She smiled then, and it was both the most beautiful and most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "I want to be remembered," she whispered. "I want someone to know my story, to carry it with them. Will you do that for me? Will you remember Eleanor Whitmore?" Before I could answer, she pressed her palm against my cheek, and the world exploded into sensation. Images flashed through my mind like lightning. A young woman in love, a wedding in a small country church, the joy of holding her first child, the agony of loss as fever claimed that child in the harsh winter of 1888. I saw Eleanor's descent into madness, her husband's growing distance, the whispers of the townspeople who said she spent too much time at her baby's grave. I felt her final moments, the deliberate overdose of laudanum, the peaceful darkness that finally took away her pain, and then the awakening, the horrible realization that death had not brought the peace she'd sought, that her grief had anchored her to this place, condemned her to an existence of endless mourning. The visions ended as suddenly as they begun, and I found myself on my knees in the mud, gasping for air. Eleanor stood over me, her expression now gentle, almost grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now someone will remember." She began to fade then, becoming translucent, then transparent, until only the faintest outline remained. "Take care of my garden," she said, her voice now barely audible above the rain. "The roses need tending." And then she was gone. I don't know how long I knelt there in the mud and rain. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. When I finally struggled to my feet, I was shaking uncontrollably and my torch had gone out. I fumbled for my mobile phone, using its weak light to guide me back to the security hut. I should have written up an incident report, should have called my supervisor or the police or someone. Instead, I sat in my chair, wrapped in a blanket, drinking cup after cup of hot tea, and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. Instead of going straight home after my shift, I visited the cemetery during daylight hours. I found Eleanor's grave easily. It was exactly where I'd encountered her the night before. But now I could see things I'd missed in the darkness. The headstone was indeed well maintained, but not by the cemetery staff. Someone, or something, had been caring for it personally. The granite was polished to a mirror shine, and the carved rose had been traced with fresh gold leaf around the base of the monument. Someone had planted a small garden of white roses that should have been long dead in the October frost, but were instead blooming as if it were the height of summer. I spent my lunch break in the cemetery's administrative office, researching Eleanor Whitmore's story. What I found confirmed everything I'd seen in those visions. She'd been 24 when she married Thomas Whitmore, a prosperous merchant. They'd been deeply in love by all accounts, and when their son Samuel was born in 1887, their happiness seemed complete. But Samuel died of scarlet fever at just 18 months old. The records showed that Eleanor never fully recovered from the loss. She became increasingly withdrawn, spending entire days at the cemetery, talking to her child's grave as if he were still alive. Thomas tried to help her, but grief had built a wall around her heart that no amount of love could penetrate. She died by her own hand on October 13th, 1889, exactly 132 years before my encounter with her. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental overdose, but the newspaper account suggested everyone knew the truth. She was buried next to her son in the family plot. And Thomas left town shortly after the funeral, unable to bear the memories. But here's what really shook me. I wasn't the first security guard to report strange encounters in that section of the cemetery. The administrative files contained reports dating back decades, all describing similar experiences. A woman in white, the sound of singing, flowers blooming out of season, and always on October 13th. I continued working at Greenwood Cemetery for 3 more months after that night, but I never encountered Eleanor again. However, I found myself drawn to her grave during my rounds. I began bringing small bouquets of white roses, which I placed beside the headstone. Each morning, I'd find them perfectly arranged, as if grateful hands had repositioned them during the night. The other guards thought I was going a bit soft, talking about tending graves that weren't part of our official duties. But they didn't understand. Eleanor had shown me her story, had trusted me with her pain, and I felt responsible for keeping her memory alive. I left that job in February, when a position opened up with better hours and pay in town. But even now, 3 years later, I return to Greenwood Cemetery every October 13th. I bring fresh roses for Eleanor's garden, and I sit by her grave for a while, telling her about the outside world, sharing news and stories, as if she were an old friend. I've never seen her again, but sometimes I catch the faint scent of roses on the wind, or hear the echo of that haunting lullaby in the distance. And I know she's listening. I know she's grateful. You might think I'm mad, sharing this story with you. Perhaps I am. But I've learned that some encounters change you in ways you never expect. Eleanor didn't just show me her story. She showed me that grief doesn't end with death, that love can transcend the boundary between life and whatever comes after, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another soul is simply to remember. The rain outside my window is slowing now, fading to the gentle patter that will eventually give way to silence. But Eleanor's story continues, carried forward by anyone willing to listen, anyone willing to remember that she lived, she loved, she lost, and in her ways she endures. Do me a favor, will you? If you're ever in upstate New York, if you happen to pass by Greenwood Cemetery, look for the old section with the black granite headstone and the impossible garden of white roses. Leave a flower if you can. Say her name, Eleanor Whitmore, because being remembered, truly remembered, might be the closest thing to peace any of us ever find. And on stormy nights like this, when the rain drums against your windows and the darkness seems deeper than it should, perhaps you'll think of Eleanor, still tending her impossible garden, still singing her lullabies to the child she lost so long ago. Some stories, once heard, become part of you forever. This is one of them. Sweet dreams.